The explosion could be heard over 100 miles away. For a few terrible seconds, the sea itself seemed to split open. The night sky ignited like a second sun. The blast rocked ships at anchor, shattered windows in distant villages, and sent a plume of fire and debris 1,000 feet into the air. Men on both sides, British and French, stood stunned on their decks, watching in horror as the largest warship in the Mediterranean vanished in a single blinding flash. It was August 1st, 1798, and the L'Orient, flagship of the French fleet, was gone. What caused it? Who survived it? And how did a single ship's destruction come to symbolize the turning point in one of the most brutal naval battles in history? This is the true story of the fire aboard the L'Orient, and the night the Nile caught fire. To understand the tragedy of the L'Orient, you have to start with Napoleon. At just 28 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte had already risen to power as a general in revolutionary France. But in 1798, his ambition wasn't just political, it was global. His eyes were fixed on the East, specifically Egypt. The British Empire controlled much of the trade to India, and France's economy, still reeling from the revolution, was desperate for a new path to power. Napoleon believed that by invading Egypt, he could strike a blow to British interests, seize the gateway to the Middle East, and establish a French presence on the far edge of the Ottoman Empire. But to get there, he needed a fleet, a massive one. In May of 1798, over 300 ships left Toulon, carrying 40,000 men. Among them were scientists, engineers, and historians, as well as infantry, cavalry, and gunners. It was one of the largest expeditionary forces France had ever assembled. And at the center of it all, the L'Orient. A 3-deck ship of the line, she was one of the most heavily armed vessels afloat. With 120 guns, nearly 1,100 crew members, and over 2,000 barrels of gunpowder in her belly, she was a floating fortress. Originally built in Spain and captured by the French, the L'Orient had become the jewel of the French Navy. She was enormous, elegant, and deeply symbolic. Napoleon himself sailed aboard her. The French reached Egypt in early July. They landed in Alexandria and quickly defeated the local Mamluk forces. Napoleon's army began marching inland toward Cairo, eager to secure the territory before the British caught wind of the operation. But back at sea, a different kind of war was brewing, because the British Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, had been hunting the French. Nelson had missed them in the Mediterranean by only days. But after receiving intelligence that Napoleon had landed in Egypt, Nelson turned his fleet south. On August 1st, the British ships sighted the French anchored in Aboukir Bay, just east of Alexandria. The French fleet was lined up in a crescent formation, anchored close to the shore. They believed this position was secure, shallow waters to one side and the open sea to the other. No enemy ship would dare approach from the shore side. The water was too shallow for safe navigation. Or so they thought. Nelson had other plans. He ordered his ships to split, some attacking the French line from the seaward side, while others slipped between the anchored French ships and the shore, exploiting a narrow channel that no one believed was navigable. The French had made a fatal assumption, and Nelson called their bluff. The battle began at sunset. As the first shots rang out across Aboukir Bay, the sea turned orange with firelight. Gunpowder smoke rolled across the water. Ships groaned as their hulls were torn open by cannonballs the size of pumpkins. The British came in hard and fast, firing broadsides at point-blank range. French sailors scrambled to return fire, but they were caught off guard. Many ships had their sails furled and crews ashore. The British had the wind, the initiative, and the momentum, and in the center of the French line, towering above the others, sat the L'Orient. Her captain, Luc Julien Joseph Casabianca, was a decorated officer, fiercely loyal to the Republic. He knew the L'Orient was the linchpin of their defense. If she fell, the fleet would collapse. He ordered his gunners to hold fast, to fight to the last. As the battle raged into the night, the L'Orient came under attack from two British ships, the Bellerophon and the Swiftsure. The French flagship answered with thundering broadsides, lighting up the bay. But the British were relentless. Flaming wads of canvas, known as hot shot, began to rain down on the L'Orient. At first, the fires were small, just sparks on deck, quickly stamped out. Then came a direct hit. A shell penetrated below decks, into the officers' quarters. Fire spread quickly. The decks were packed with supplies, sails, ropes, tar, and most critically, gunpowder. Within minutes, flames were licking at the powder magazine. Casabianca gave the order to flood the lower decks, trying to douse the fire. But it was too late. The L'Orient was a tinderbox. Witnesses said the ship began to glow from within, a red aura pulsing behind her gun ports. Some British sailors stopped firing, stunned by the sight. Others shouted warnings to take cover. And then, at around 10 p.m., the L'Orient exploded. The fire reached the main magazine and ignited over 2,000 barrels of powder. The blast tore through the hull with a force no one had ever seen before. The ship disintegrated instantly. Mast, timbers, sails, and bodies were hurled skyward. A flaming column rose into the night, visible for miles. Debris rained down on nearby ships, both British and French. One French sailor later described seeing an entire cannon, still glowing red, fall from the sky and punch through a neighboring ship. The sea itself seemed to recoil. The water surged outward in a sudden wave, rocking anchored vessels. Smaller boats were capsized by the shockwave. Silence followed, not for seconds, for minutes. Both sides stopped firing. No one moved. They just stared at the empty patch of sea where the most powerful ship in the Mediterranean had been, seconds ago. The death toll was staggering. Most of the L'Orient's crew was killed instantly. Over 1,000 men died in the explosion, among them Captain Casabianca and his son. The boy, 12 years old, had been aboard the ship as a midshipman. His father reportedly ordered him to stay at his post and not abandon ship, even as flames closed in. Witnesses said the child was last seen still at his station, refusing to leave. The image of that boy, standing alone on a burning deck, would become immortalized in art and poetry across Europe, especially in the poem Casabianca, written decades later by Felicia Hemans. The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled. The destruction of the L'Orient shattered French morale. The remaining French ships began to surrender or flee. By morning, 11 of their 13 ships of the line were destroyed or captured. Nelson's gamble had paid off. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in British history, and the L'Orient, in death, had helped turn the tide. But the explosion didn't just have military consequences. It had symbolic ones. The L'Orient was meant to represent French might, French elegance, and French dominance in the Mediterranean. Her destruction was a humiliation. Napoleon, who had already marched inland by the time of the battle, was now stranded in Egypt. With the French fleet destroyed, British ships blockaded the coast, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. Napoleon's grand ambitions in the east began to crumble. He would never fully recover from the logistical blow dealt that night. The explosion of the L'Orient didn't just sink a ship. It sealed the fate of the entire Egyptian campaign. Even today, divers still explore the seabed of Aboukir Bay. Fragments of the L'Orient have been recovered. Cannonballs, copper fittings, scorched timbers. In the 1990s, French archaeologists led an expedition to map the wreck site. They found a scattered field of debris, much of it buried in layers of silt. And they found something else: gold coins. Dozens of them. Rumors had long swirled that the L'Orient had been carrying treasure, perhaps even the payroll for Napoleon's army. Some say the explosion scattered it across the seafloor. Others believe it's still buried beneath layers of wreckage and time. But the real treasure is the story itself, a cautionary tale about hubris, about fire and powder, about how, in war, one spark can rewrite history. The Lorient went down in flames on a hot Egyptian night, but her story didn't vanish with the smoke. It became legend, a floating empire undone by fire, and a reminder, etched in salt and ash, that even the mightiest ship can burn. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.